So good morning. Good
Good
morning,
morning, Anita.
Ivor in Cape Town. This is part of the series that we are launching, Future Leaders of the World, with our key partners that we have worked with and picked to work with in our business who have the right energy, the right experience, the right skills, and they are people who help to show the way, who know the way, and who help others in organizations go the way. Ivor Clucas is an experienced businessman himself and leader and facilitator of his own business, True North Strategy. So welcome, Ive, to this call. Thank you for your time today and for being able to share here in this space authentically to people what's been going on in this period of time, some of the wisdoms, the practical applications, the processes that you have been helping as almost a pilot, where we find leaders and teams that have moved out of the sheltered waters of sailing into the wide, stormy seas of COVID and lockdown. And Ivor climbs on board their vessel as a pilot and helps to guide and steer them towards safety. So following the True North Strategy style, this introduction and video is really about how Ivor is working successfully with teams and leaders at this time to navigate these stormy waters. So looking forward to the dialogue with you, Ive.
So am I, Anita.
So just a short note, Ivor and True North specialize in strategy, which also is very linked with culture and values in an organization. To create any kind of shift, we all know the good old tagline that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Absolutely.
So Ivor's not really just focused on the outer strategy, but he focused on the internal culture and values of organizations as well. And I can only imagine during this time some of the examples that you're going to be sharing with us today around how this has impacted both organizations' strategies, but as well as how it's impacted their culture and their values. And I would imagine has tested them quite a bit.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to hand over to you, Ive, just to be able to speak to the current climate and some of the context of the work that you've been facilitating over this time.
So Anita, yeah, the current environment is fascinating. And I think what I'd like to share to start up with is that the reason I focus on strategy is because I come from mainstream business. And in my time in mainstream business, I used to run a company called RCI. And RCI was a travel company, is a travel company. And during the time I was running it, we hit a crisis of our own when 9/11 happened. And we had to navigate a travel company when the global travel industry just crumbled overnight, literally overnight. So we really had to decide on our strategy through that. And those learnings I found have been very, very useful now. Having said that, it's also very different. We did have options then. We could resort to, for instance, domestic travel, because as long as flights weren't involved, you could still do it. Now, there's nothing happening in that space. And my heart goes out to people in that industry because it's a very, very difficult space to navigate right now. Different industries are in different places in this time. Some are actually thriving. I work with some technology companies right now who are thriving right now because their products, their services are more demand than ever. However, their clients are hitting harder and harder times. And that will have the roll-on effect with them, where they'll start seeing their businesses suffering. We see the banks now. I work with financial services companies, banks, insurance companies, where their clients are no longer able to pay for their bonds, their credit cards, their insurance policies, and so on. So they might be in a good space, but their clients are not. So the roll-on effects of where we are really amazing. And I think life-changing, world-changing, these are all things that we're hearing all the time and we're being bombarded with, as you and I were chatting about a short while ago. The word crisis is also bandied around a lot, and I don't think it's a crisis anymore. I think it's just a reality. And when I started working with a lot of my clients through this time, I put together a process called Navigating Stormy Waters, because that's what it felt like we were going into, very obviously. But I also put together a few scenarios. And the first scenario was, is this a storm, short term, over quickly? Or is it a winter, longer term, maybe longer term impacts? Or is it a mini ice age, much longer term, much greater impacts? And at this point, 2-3 months in, I would say that the concept of a storm is no longer even applicable. It's done and dusted, it's gone. The storm is gone, and it now is either winter or mini ice age. And I'm using some guiding principles with the clients because, as you quite rightly said, we can talk about planning and strategy and so on, but if we ignore the concept of culture and how we're going to get the best of our people, acknowledging the fears that they are experiencing, the problems they're experiencing, we are not going to have an effective strategy in the first place. The two go hand in hand. I don't see them as any different. The one's deciding on a direction, the other is how we're going to get there, how we're going to work together in order to achieve that. It's one and the same. So my guiding principles are very simply things like planning, but plan for clear scenarios. Don't just plan for one scenario, because we don't know. None of us know. And this is the one time, I think we always say to leaders, don't be a know-it-all. Source information from your colleagues, from the wide world out there, lots of different data sources, and learn from one another. Now really is a time to do that, because none of us know. So we firstly need to plan for scenarios. Some people have said, why plan? We don't know. I think it's more important than ever. You don't sail into a storm without a clear destination, because all you'll do is end up sinking, definite, guaranteed. So you need those potential destinations depending on the severity of the storm and how long it lasts. And then you need to know how you're going to navigate through to those destinations. Now, what I mean by that is, if we don't have regular, robust reviews of our plan, we won't know where we're going. So we need to have those scenarios, but then review all the time, weekly, fortnightly, whatever it might be, to check that we're still on track. Are we now heading towards a winter, a mini ice age? What is it? We need to keep checking our direction. That's the one thing. The second thing is, what's in our control, what's not in our control. And I think if we just focus on everything that's going on around us, which is not in our control to a large extent, it will be scary, frustrating, and we won't get a whole lot of productivity achieved. So let's bring it back to what we can control and influence. Also, our agility. I talked about regular rhythm of robust reviews. That's agility. It's checking in on a regular basis and saying, maybe we have to change this because this is not going to work. We thought it was going to work two weeks ago, but it's not. So let's be agile, let's change. Otherwise, we're going to be the sitting ducks in the marketplace. We don't want to be the sitting ducks in the marketplace. Then there is the concept of the human spirit. People are not going to just leave our companies and go to other companies for employment, because there's not many jobs out there. However, they might stay in the company and they might actually be fearful. They might be worried all the time, anxious all the time, and therefore distracted and unproductive. So while we have them in our organization, let's focus on how we can get the best out of them, leverage that human spirit, which is very powerful when you can leverage it effectively. I think a fundamental principle for me coming out of this is, what are we going to learn, unlearn, relearn? Alvin Toffler's wonderful quote. And that is part of the agility, constantly checking in on the learnings, constantly checking in on what we might need to unlearn that was working just a month ago. And what we might be doing well, but we need to do differently. Like, for instance, we're now working on virtual mediums. The way we run our meetings, the way we run our interactions might be very different. And I've had various experiences in this regard as well, where technology can be a wonderful enabler or a disabler, depending on how we use it. And that's a constant learning for me and for all my clients. So those are just a few thoughts that I had in terms of principles, guiding principles to help us get through this. I was going to say storm, but we've just agreed it's not a storm. Perhaps through this winter or this mini ice age, in a boat that's still floating at the end and alive and able to take us to one of our destination scenarios. So those are
I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Ivor. Some real rich gems there. And just to ask a practical question, because I know this has affected all of us as coaches, consultants, facilitators, business owners, and entrepreneurs in our own right. What has your experience been in True North around your own adaptation and agility to work and deliver your work differently? And what has had a change for you in that regard, that you'll be able to provide the quality of service and still bring all this wisdom and wonderful experience to benefit your clients in this time?
Well, firstly, I mean, we have our own businesses, you, me, and people in our space. And our businesses are being impacted by this directly and in many cases, severely. So we have to navigate the same as what our clients are going through. And that in itself is a huge learning. And also, I'm an old dog, but I'm having to learn new tricks. And technology is one of them. I always thought the only way to do it is in a room with people face to face. And certainly there are some instances where that remains the case, but there's a lot of instances where that doesn't remain the case and where technology is a great enabler. What I am finding, though, is that you have to be a lot more deliberate and mindful about the way you approach any sort of interaction with clients or clients with their own people and their teams, because you cannot just rely on your old style of doing things. So little techniques that I practice is when I'm going through a session with a team, I review a lot to them. I summarize a lot of what they've said back to them, allowing them just to pause and listen, as opposed to just moving from one principle or topic to the next. Because that deliberateness helps them just digest, think a little bit more. And it's something we should probably do all the time, but it's just become more clear to me in this medium. That's one thing that I think has been very helpful. The other thing is that connectedness. I found that my clients were connecting very easily and very quickly in the early stages of lockdown. They are getting frustrated now. And I know we're coming out of level 4 into level 3, but the frustration is starting to tell in terms of the lack of personal connectedness, eyeballing one another in a room, seeing body language and so on. Because a lot of the times we're working on products where you can't actually see people all the time because they're just literally on call-in modes. And so you're going purely on voice, and that is quite challenging. It can work, but it's challenging. So there's definitely a hankering after a greater level of connectedness. There's no question about that. But there's been increases in productivity. There's been increases in connectedness in some ways because people are being deliberate about it. They're setting up regular catch-ups with their teams where they're talking about how they're doing, how they're feeling, and so on. Another big learning is boundaries. You know, at the moment, clients of mine, myself, we're not quite sure if we are working from home or living at our place of work, because it's become blurred. And that's proving to be a big challenge for our clients and for people like us. Because if you don't consciously and deliberately, again, the same two words, put those boundaries in place, there will be none. And that blurring is going to take its toll if it hasn't already started taking its toll on people. So those are just two quick learnings. Productivity has gone up in many instances. Meetings have become more efficient in many instances. So I think there's good and bad. There's good and bad coming out of this. For us, it's about learning from the good and getting rid of the bad.
Thank you. Those are amazing tips and nuggets to take away. And I also really love one of your own, call it mantras, is whatever we practice, we get good at. And something about establishing these mindful daily habits like boundary setting, for example, finding ways to connect both with others and with ourselves more deeply to nourish those parts that we can't access during this time. So thank you so much for that. Been a really interesting call.
Thank you, Anita. Anytime.
And good luck, and may you go forward from strength to strength and continue to be the pilot in these times to help steer these vessels through these tricky waters.
Thank you, Anita. All the best to you and Flo as well.
Thanks.